Rising sword. After several close calls of Kaelin approaching into the Queen's bedchamber and nearly seeing Dear Maurice sprawled in the Queen's bed uncloaked and unveiled, Shayla established a warning system using her faithful servants as a network of messengers. They kept careful eyes on Kaelin as he moved throughout the castle and forwarded regular updates to the Queen. They used hand signals and coded words to alert others in the network if Kaelin was heading towards either the inner courtyard or the Queen's bedchamber. The servants did not know why they were asked to keep an account of the king's whereabouts, they only knew that their task was important to the Queen. That was enough for them. Ultimately, the messages would reach Loaza, Eowyn, or the only other servants who knew of Dear Maurice's secret, the triplets, He Young, Wojuong, and Hyo Sun. Only these 5 women would warn Shayla directly. Shayla slept peacefully knowing that she had a network of eyes watching over her and her daughters, Mieko and Dear Maurice, who slept on her bed to the right. The sun had long since crept under the horizon and darkness loomed over Nyansvit. The province was quiet. Raiders had not attacked in months and everyone in the castle was in better spirits. Earlier Shayla had fallen asleep after chuckling at how the girls slept, inverted head to feet, like the yin-yang symbol. The girls slept this way all the time. Regardless of what position they were in when they fell asleep, they'd always end up perfectly inverted. It was uncanny how they intuitively supported each other. When one pushed, the other pulled. When one was weak, the other was strong. The girls were so alike in many ways it seemed absurd to see them as anything other than biologically related, but the truth was, the only connection between Mieko and Dear Maurice was purely emotional. There was, however, one way in which they were truly different. Mieko always slept soundly. Dear Maurice, on the other hand, was subject to horrible nightmares that would awaken her at night. The dreams were obscure and often made no sense to her. When the nightmares came, they were vivid, abstract, and very scary. Dear Maurice stirred in her sleep again, mumbling and groaning softly, reaching out towards something and then swatting it away. She rolled over and woke up Shayla. Shayla sat up and carefully watched her daughter's troubled sleep. She knew that some dreams had purpose, regardless of how awful it was to have them. She also knew that she might do more harm than good if she were to stop the dream before its message was made manifest. So she watched Dear Maurice with concern, awaiting a sign of the best time to end her psychological pain. Dear Maurice suddenly went still. Her rapid breathing slowed to almost nothing. Shayla leaned in closer, checking to make sure Dear Maurice's chest rose and fell with each breath. Satisfied, she leaned back and waited. In her dream, Dear Maurice ran barefoot across the brick floor of a dark corridor in a decrepit castle. She slipped and nearly lost her balance. When she looked down at her feet, she saw they were covered in blood. She snatched a flaming torch from the wall and waved it at the floor. There was a moment of relief in her eyes and then she gasped in horror. Her feet weren't injured. The floor was filling up with blood that began flowing across her feet with an ever-increasing current. She ran from the rushing stream of blood, pushed her way through a thin wooden door to a great room. She ducked in and hid behind a stone corner. She checked to make sure the blood hadn't followed her, and when she inspected her feet, they were dry and possessed no signs of the horror she witnessed just moments earlier. She was about to breathe a sigh of relief when she looked up and spotted 2 masked men fighting. The men were dressed as warriors. The first warrior wore a white mask with no features except eyes to see. It was faceless. The second warrior wore a red mask with white eyes and a white mouth. Dear Maurice tried to sneak her behind the men towards the open door on the other side of the great room, but she found herself caught in the middle of the battle. She fell to the floor and covered her eyes as the warriors charged each other and grappled over her. They thrust their swords into each other with one hand and each grabbed Dear Maurice by the neck with the other. As she fought to breathe, the room began to dim, and just before the blacked out, the 2 masked men leaned in together, just inches away from her face, and began to laugh. Dear Maurice gasped for air as she awoke from her nightmare and opened her eyes. She searched the room for danger but found only Shayla. Her face was luminescent from the candle glow and she offered Dear Maurice a reassuring smile. As Shayla expected, Dear Maurice immediately crawled over Mieko and into her arms. "Another nightmare, my dearest?" Shayla asked quietly. Dear Maurice nodded. She was still too upset to speak. To show her contentment, she nestled her chin into Shayla's bosom. "No worry, Diemori," she said pointedly. "We must work to return that sad face to the night and put on your sleepy face." Diemori nodded emphatically. "Shall I tell you a story?" Diemori nodded again. "What story shall we explore this time?" Shayla quizzed. "My favorite," Diemori uttered in half-mumble. "I am sorry my nightmare disturbed your sleep, Queen." Shayla felt Diemori shivering and wrapped both arms around her. She pulled Diemori deeper into her bosom and placed her forefinger beneath Diemori's chin to lift her head to see her drowsy eyes. "Your sleepy face makes me happy, regardless of the time of day or night," she reassured her. Shayla waited a few moments. She knew there was more to this discussion, but the next step belonged to Diemori. If she wanted comfort and reassurance, Shayla was there to provide an endless amount. If Diemori needed to talk and needed someone to listen and help her understand the meaning of her dreams, Shayla would provide as much care and insight as a mother could. "May I tell you my dream, Mother?" Diemori whispered. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She felt Shayla's body shake as she nodded her head. "I dreamed a great man was very angry with me and shouted at me, saying, 'Duty over love.' I ran from him and entered a very bad place and there was blood on the floor. Duty over love is a difficult sacrifice," Shayla ruminated. "It is a sacrifice that is only asked of those chosen for a great purpose. I know of only one other who has made such a sacrifice." "Really?" she mumbled. "Who is this person?" Diemori had already begun to drift off to sleep again. Her eyes were heavy and teetering closed. She was asleep before the last word left her mouth. Shayla waited a few moments until she heard the soft rustle of Diemori's nasally breathing. "Your mother," Shayla whispered into her ear and kissed her cheek. Diemori snuggled closer. Suddenly Shayla cocked her ear to the air and listened. She could faintly hear the metallic clank of swords echoing in the corridors. The great room was a gargantuan room, with high ceilings, walls constructed with layers of quartz sandstone, limestone cobblestone flooring and thick marble columns scattered throughout. It served two purposes. It was a place where the king gathered his most important advisors and conducted his most important business. It was also the one place large enough and fortified enough for Kaelin to perfect his martial arts skills. Most rooms in the castle could not stand up to the punishing treatment Kaelin unleashed when he practiced. Not only was he blessed with natural ability bestowed upon him by his father, Emperor Gerwolf, he was a dedicated practitioner, with a commitment to perfection that bordered on obsessiveness. Kaelin looked at his skill as a trade. He practiced every day regardless of what events, wars, battles, or maladies occurred. But more than a trade, maintaining his proficiency with Rising Sword, a unique swordplay and martial arts technique taught to him by Emperor Gerwolf, was an honor. He would not allow himself to disgrace his forefathers or his legacy by being anything other than a perfect student of the technique. And that meant practice. If a man were a warrior in battle, he did not want to be on the opposite side of Kaelin's sword. But if that man were merely a spectator, watching Kaelin fight or practice was a sight to behold with wonder. He was as graceful as a panther, as powerful as a rhinoceros, and as elegant as a falcon in flight. His movements were fluid and connected as if part of a grand continuous plan, but when he struck it was with a power that shook the earth until it stopped. This was exactly the image that occurred to Shayla when she stepped through a small doorway in the corner of the great room and saw the dark and furious expression in Kaelin's eyes as he practiced. Rising sword. Twisting dagger. Attack. Defend. Evade. Block. Kaelin huffed only slightly out of breath as he punched, kicked at the air and swung his sword. Strike hard. Be swift. Contain your emotion. He recited like a child learning through rote repetition. He kicked the air as he swung his sword in buzzsaw fashion. He leveled front kicks, side kicks, roundhouses, and back kicks at an invisible assailant, but his sword never stopped moving. These techniques have no rival, except each other, he bellowed at the air as he punched and swung the sword wildly. You can never be one until you bond. He was shouting now. Shayla could see that Kaelin's practice had been interrupted by memories that haunted him. Kaelin was a different man when she first met him. He was a man worthy of love and devotion. He'd since changed. Now he was angry and his eyes were wild. She found herself wishing they could go back to the time before everything changed. Her heart started to beat faster as she thought about Kaelin in a way she hadn't thought about in a decade. At that very moment, she missed him. Kaelin sliced the air with his sword and brutally struck the marble column nearest him. A chunk of stone flew through the air and he watched it land at Shayla's bare feet. He looked up, surprised to see his queen watching him. He unconsciously uttered a quick gasp as he surveyed Shayla, standing in a purple gossamer nightgown that stopped just above her knees. Shayla took a moment to appreciate Kaelin's sweaty, perfectly chiseled body. At that very moment it occurred to her that she did not know when she'd ever see him like this again. "You fight with such anger, my lord," she said softly as she moved closer. "Like a man possessed. My apologies if I disturbed you, and the princess." He huffed softly as he took a deep calming breath. Shayla heard the distinct tone of sincerity in his voice. It caught her by surprise and she found herself staring at him, marveling over his body as if he wasn't looking back at her. When she realized what she had done, she blushed. She was terribly embarrassed, but she could not stop her legs from taking a step closer to him. "You mentioned the princess," she said nervously. "Have you seen her in my bed?" "I see children in your bed quite often," he answered sharply, but his legs felt dull and heavy for some reason. He thought to himself that it would be wise not to move and stumble or appear clumsy. He stood still as he continued, "It seems you welcome them in your bed more than your king." Shayla moved even closer. She could reach out and touch him if she wanted to. She did want to. This was new and different. It felt good. "There are times that I remember, with great fondness, the king in my bed," she admitted. She couldn't stop herself from touching his chest. She traced the center of his tight chest down to his abdomen and Kaelin shivered. Impulsively he snatched her close. His touch was firm but gentle. He leaned in to kiss her and she didn't refuse. Their lips touched and there was a blast of electricity through their bodies. His hands were all over her now, and she responded to every touch with a moan. Then she felt his hot hands on the back of her leg. The heat radiated as deep as his tongue inside her mouth. Kaelin could hear his blood pumping through his arteries in his chest and neck, thundering in his ears. And then her passion quickly waned. She pulled away and locked eyes with Kaelin. The puzzled look on his face melted her heart. "I do remember the king in my bed. But I also remember why there are now 2 children in my bed." Kaelin's puzzled expression metamorphosed into frustration and then anger. His eyes narrowed and his fists clenched subconsciously. Shayla took a step back. Whatever consequences came, she'd told the truth. Yes, she missed him, dearly. But he had taken a part of her life away and kept it hidden, locked in a box like an animal. She'd never forgive him for that. Kaelin knew from the look in her eyes that their moment was gone and would never come again. He wanted to shake it off like it was nothing, but she had rejected him and he was hurt. He sniggered as he walked to the large banquet table and returned his sword to its sheath. He turned back to her and shook his head. Now it was his turn to reject her. "Have you come to plead for that creature again?" he mocked. "Gone." That's what Kaelin saw in Shayla's eyes. She was gone, all that was left was a blank stare. She'd tuned out in preparation for the worst and he did not disappoint. "Too often your ugly words cloud memories of the man I once knew," she retorted. Alas, D'Amory's birthday approaches. As is tradition between father and child, student and teacher, she must be taught as your father taught you. Kaelin's guffaw was eerie and unnerving. "Are you mad?" he yelled. "You want me to teach that child my father's sacred training, rising sword? Why would I ever do that? I believed you would do this one thing because you have taken everything else from her," Shayla answered. He waved her off and walked away. "She has lost her mind," he thought to himself. "Why would I train the child who has been prophesied to take away my throne?" He'd lost interest in Shayla and the matter was equally irrelevant to him. Shayla ran closer to plead her case. "My lord, grant her this one thing, and I will give myself to you. I will never again deny you." Kaelin stopped in his tracks. He pondered the idea for a moment and turned back to Shayla. He stared into her eyes. There was no deceit, no conniving, and no facade. She would be true to her word. You would do this? He asked. For a servant? Kaelin scoffed and stormed off in disgust. Shayla ran before him to block his path. She grabbed his arm to keep him from walking away. He could have easily pushed her aside and she knew it. She had to try something. How can you marvel at my devotion to her? She pleaded. I would do anything for D'Amory. She is of my flesh and of my heart. I will sacrifice myself for her. With lightning-fast speed, Kaelin grabbed Shayla's hair with his right hand and pulled her close with his left. She never saw it coming. She looked into the fierceness of his eyes, and for a moment it occurred to her that she might never see her children again. No, Shayla, he sneered. I will never leverage my way into your bed. Keep your sacrifice, he mumbled as he easily pushed her aside. She stumbled, scraped the balls of her delicate foot against the stone floor and yelped as she lost balance and fell backward. Kaelin never turned back to see if she was hurt. Shayla didn't see much of Kaelin for the next fortnight. They passed each other in the hallways and corridors a few times. She'd bow respectfully and had even touched his arm with concern when she learned he was leading a dangerous reconnaissance mission to locate the base of the raiders, who seemed to be growing in numbers according to Folson's spies and scouts. But that was it. They didn't exchange pleasantries, never kept each other's glance for more than a moment, and never had a night like the time Shayla walked in on his training. Their marriage was emotionally dead, and now it was purely functional and for appearances only. The end of her marriage was a psychological trauma for Shayla. She'd been raised and trained to be the perfect wife, and then selected as the best choice for the future king. The failure of her marriage meant that she'd failed her duty in some way, and she took that to heart. She prayed on it, asked the spirits of the Black Wildwood for forgiveness, and even vowed to be open to the resurrection of her love for Kaelin if the spirits ever allowed it. She would not fail twice. However, emotionally, Shayla was at ease. Kaelin stayed as far away from her, Mieko and D'Amory as was possible in the large castle. There were a few incidents when he sent for Mieko under the guise of partaking in traditional father-daughter interactions, but these exchanges never exceeded a half-hour at the most. Afterwards, neither Shayla nor Mieko would see him for several days. Shayla relished this time. She was free, and most importantly, D'Amory was free. She spent hours in the inner courtyard without her cloak, hood, or veil. She ran barefoot in the stone floors and stared at her uncovered reflection in the courtyard pond for hours. There were times that D'Amory would ask about the king and Shayla would simply say that he was busy. She could see that D'Amory missed Kaelin, regardless of how unaffected he behaved towards her. It was especially difficult for D'Amory during the times that Kaelin sent for Mieko. She was not used to being without her sister, and knowing that she was not included in specific activities for the princess hurt her. She tried to mask her emotions, but Shayla could see how she felt. A mother can always sense her daughter's pain. There was a palpable connection between D'Amory, Mieko, and Kaelin. Shayla couldn't deny it, nor did she try. She enforced the king's rules, trained Mieko to be a princess, and kept D'Amory safe. Everything else she left to fate. Kaelin was in good spirits. On one of the scouting missions, his warriors captured a raider and forced him to tell more about the raiders' hideout. What they learned was that the raiders were merely a ragtag group of beggars, thieves, rapists, who'd bonded together for the sake of crime. They took what they wanted and they paid homage to no king. This satisfied Kaelin immensely. Men like this would sooner destroy themselves than affect the legacy of a powerful kingdom. All Kaelin had to do was wait it out. The raiders would self-destruct over time. Word had come to Shayla that Kaelin was back in the castle. Wojuong saw him in the royal drawing room looking over the fine artwork, penmanship, and calligraphy left to dry. She'd gotten word to Eilin through the castle network, and Eilin made sure D'Amory was cloaked and covered as she read to both the girls in the withdrawing room opposite the large dining table in the great room. Shayla listened as she was served tea by Hyung, and Hweosun stood behind the throne. None were surprised when Kaelin suddenly appeared and stood at the door watching. His eyes were soft and he was smiling as he watched, become mesmerized by Eilин's words. Shayla thought she saw love in his eyes and warmth in his expression. It made her smile too. She watched in silence for a few moments as she studied him. Could she have been wrong about Kaelin? After all, he is an emperor and he has an empire to protect and govern. Perhaps the stress of ruling has finally started to fade and he can rejoin his family as a father, not just a king. Shayla laid down her cup of tea. "Welcome, Emperor," she greeted him. Everyone stood and bowed. Kaelin waved them off and they took their seats again. Shayla spoke just above a whisper. "Eilin is telling the story of Kongjui and Potjui. Your mother told you the story when you were a child, did she not? I remember you said she added great warriors and conflict to quench your boyish appetite for battle." Kaelin nodded absent-mindedly and never took his eye off Eilin, Diemori, and Mieko in the corner. Shayla noticed that he was holding something behind his back. When she'd gotten a proper look at it, she smiled. Kaelin moved the rolled parchment paper from behind him and held it in front. Shayla could see elegant calligraphy written on the paper. Kaelin cleared his throat loudly and Eilin stopped her story. She bowed and backed away, tugging at Diemori to remind her to come with her. Diemori hadn't seen the king in more than a sennight and she was likely to become hypnotized by his presence again. Eilin did not have time for that, so she pulled Diemori away so she could join the other servants. Kaelin waved Mieko closed as he unraveled the parchment paper. "Great scholars strive to write with such elegance as you," he said as he marveled over the perfect penmanship. "Well done." His face was beaming with pride. Shayla squinted to see more of the parchment until she recognized the handwriting. She nodded to herself and smiled knowingly. Mieko looked at the parchment and frowned. "I am sorry, father." Mieko corrected him. "This is not my work. That is in the hand of Diemori." Diemori was tucked behind Hyung and Eilin when she heard Mieko say her name. She pushed through and spotted the parchment in Kaelin's hands. He'd complimented the work, her work, and he had smiled. Finally, she thought. She stood straight as a tree, looked toward the stone floor and prepared to receive the king's praise. When no praise came, she slowly raised her head and eyes, fully prepared to avoid Kaelin's eyes if she found him looking back at her. She saw his face and cringed. His smile had evaporated. The scowl on his face was terrifying. If Diemori hadn't known better, she would have sworn he'd gone mad in an instant. She cowered back and ran to hide behind Hyung and Eilin. Kaelin sneered, and then turned his piercing gaze to Shayla. The left side of his upper lip curled upward in a mocking expression of distaste. "Is this your idea of keeping Diemori in her place?" He snickered. "You allowed her to attend imperial classes?" Shayla was taken aback by the sudden turn of events. It took a few moments of looking back and forth between Diemori hiding and the angry king for her to gather thoughts on the matter. I did not think it mattered," was all she could say. Kaelin stomped over Shayla. His face was fierce and his fists were clenched, but she was not afraid. There was something about the way he walked. Something was missing, but she couldn't put a name to it, and she didn't have much time. He was upon her in seconds, nearly nose to nose. "She is a mindless servant who can no more write than a cow," he shouted. It hurt. It hurt so badly that Diemori couldn't stop the sob from erupting from deep inside her. She gasped and took deep breaths to stifle it, but it was no use. She was bawling. Her heart was broken and there was nothing left to do but cry. She did. And then she ran. She took off running at full speed, across the room, past the table and through the servants' entrance. All the while sobbing. Kaelin watched her run. There was a flash of a semi-equals human micro-expression in his eyes, and then he sneered as he ripped the parchment in several pieces and tossed them into the air. "You are a foolish queen," he barked as he moved to the door. He stopped and turned back to lock eyes with Mieko, who was petrified at this point. She didn't move. She couldn't even avert her eyes, although deep inside she knew she was violating protocol. "Mieko," he bellowed. "Tomorrow we begin your instruction. I will teach you the rising sword, as my father, Emperor Gerwolf, taught me." He stormed out in the opposite direction, through the main entrance. "Eilin," Shayla said calmly. "Keep Mieko here while I speak with Diemori." Eilin and Hyung nodded and wrapped their arms around Mieko, who'd finally gotten past the fear long enough to realize she wanted to cry. Shayla was no fool. She knew Kaelin's anger better than anyone's. She remembers his anger on the day she disappeared, and how he brutally punished the guards who'd been assigned to watch over her at all times. It didn't matter how much she protested, cried, or begged, Kaylin was livid and would not stop until the culprits had been reproved and penalized. She'd even learn what to look for when Kaylin boiled over. There were signs. Some signs were more obvious than others, but she could always tell when Kaylin was getting angry. He always did the same things when he lost his temper. But this time there was something different. There was something missing. Kaylin knew he had a temper issue. He'd had the issue since he was a child. He knew 3W it was a flaw, an issue in his character that might make him lose a battle. It was why Emperor Gerwolf always reminded him to keep his emotions in check. Shayla could always see when Kaylin was fighting against his temper. She could look in his eyes and see an epic battle between his yin and yang, between peace and war, between humility and arrogance. The inner battle was what was missing this time. Kaylin simply became angry. Shayla couldn't help but think that this was all a part of Kaylin's plan to get back at her for rejecting him that night. If it was a part of his plan, it made Kaylin an even bigger monster than she thought. How dare he verbally brutalize dear Marie to get back at me, she thought. But Shayla had to leave those thoughts alone for now. Dear Marie was hurting and she needed to find her and comfort her. The Queen, Eowyn, Mieko, dear Marie, and Hyoung had entered the great room through the main entrance. Dear Marie subconsciously fled through the servants' entrance. Kaylin had gotten to her. His venomous spiel and poisonous vitriol had damaged her spirit. Shayla knew exactly where her daughter would be hiding. She moved through the more elegant and austere wings of the castle to where the halls and corridors became antiquated and the walls were bare. The further she walked, less light filled the halls and there were no pots of beautiful flowers tucked in the corners. Shayla finally reached her destination. A large curved stone archway with a shiny granite keystone tucked into the top. It was perpetually spit-shined from a leak that dripped on it all night long. She pushed past a sliding screen door and stepped inside the servants' quarters. It was a modest room with an open floor plan and single mats for beds. The only privacy the inhabitants had came from makeshift room dividers made of splintered pieces of bamboo patches of used rice paper. Dear Marie had thrown herself into a dark corner and curled up in the fetal position as she sobbed. Her knees were pulled into her belly and her head was buried between them. Beside her was a pile of elegant parchment paper torn to shreds. She'd written the names of all the servants on the best paper Eowyn could find and had given it to them as a gift. Shayla was relieved to see her. She'd begun to have scary thoughts of dear Marie leaving the protection of the castle and wandering alone in the Black Mountain. She shrugged off the chills and welcomed the sight of her daughter, sulking or not. I must congratulate you. It was a very shrewd decision to go sulking in the servants' chambers. Shayla said in a congratulatory tone. How else can you make your queen feel so guilty? Dear Marie, not one to release her stubbornness so easily, just shrugged. Do not grieve over the heartless words of the king, Shayla said. She sat beside dear Marie and tucked her legs beneath her. She removed dear Marie's hood and cloak. She tugged at one of her gloves until it came off and then cupped dear Marie's hand in two of hers. Speak freely, child. Do not hold it in. I have only shown him love, dear Marie said with exasperation. It baffles and annoys me that he does not return love for love. Have courage. Be patient. Fight for what you desire. Shayla recited. These are the things my mother told me. I will tell them to you. Fight and I will fight to change Kaylin's heart. D.A. Marie nodded. Shayla stood. Now, come back to my chamber. She felt her breath catch as she said the words. You do not belong in this room. You belong in my room, with your family. Shayla had a horrible sleep that night. She tossed and turned and had endless nightmares that terrified her. She'd awake in a cold sweat, gasping for air and completely unable to remember any details of her dream. Other times she'd awaken suddenly, for no apparent reason. Each time she opened her eyes she had the distinct feeling that someone was looming above her, casting a dark dank shadow across her bed, watching over her with disapproving eyes. Then there was the feeling of overwhelming failure that plagued her until she crawled out of bed for relief. She thought it was best to get away from the sight of her dreams. She was so pent up and tense she might wake Mieko and dear Marie who were, for once, both sleeping soundly. Shayla moved to the window to gaze out at the black wildwood in the distance. Behind it she could see the outline of the Black Mountain, and then she heard her own voice in her head. It was like an echo stuck somewhere deep inside, trying to find its way through the labyrinth of her brain. The words were faint at first, they became clearer and louder, and she recognized the origin of the words. It was a statement she'd made to Diemori. "Fight and I will fight to change Kaylin's heart." These were the words she'd uttered to Diemori to comfort her. Now she had to be honest. Did she truly mean what she'd said? Shayla turned away from the black wildwood. She felt scrutinized by it. She scanned the dark room until her eyes found Diemori and Mieko sleeping together as always, coiled like a yin-yang symbol. She timidly walked closer, keeping a close eye on Diemori. She turned back to the outline of the Black Mountain through the window. Then back to Diemori. Her blood was pumping and her hands were trembling. She reached the edge of the bed and looked down at Diemori. She slept so peaceful and looked content with life despite the hardships that were artificially thrust upon her. Yet, there was more for her to endure. Shayla had to admit it. Her daughter was the promise. Shayla had been called to deliver the promise, and she did. She literally gave birth to it. Then the black lotus in the Black Mountain kissed Diemori's skin and blessed her with its richness. Now there was more to be done. Much more. Shayla dropped to her knees at the edge of the bed. She touched Mieko's fine, straight ebony black hair that hung down her back to her buttocks. Then she stroked Diemori's thick, shoulder-length wavy hair and twirled her fingers in her loose curls. She had given birth to only one child, but she had two daughters. For the first time she realized that everything was exactly as it was planned. "It is time you met your destiny," she said to both of her daughters. Kaylin had commandeered the inner courtyard for himself. The thrones were removed, the fountains had been drained, and every strip of non-essential furniture was taken away. The servants' exit was blocked, and the only way in or out was through the main exit. Gone were the days of abundant freedom where Diemori and Mieko could run around as little waifs, half naked, Mieko's ivory skin and Diemori's dark silver complexion looking as if day and night found a way to coexist. The inner courtyard was no longer a haven for Diemori to remove her hooded cloak and veil. Her gloves were no longer tossed hither and yon across the stone floor. Shayla would no longer be seated at her throne with Hee-young, Wojuong and Hyasun standing as watchful guards behind her as Eelin scrutinized every moment of the children to make sure no one was hurt. Now the inner courtyard was Kaylin's domain. It was the location he'd very shrewdly chosen to train Mieko in the way of the rising sword. While Kaylin never actually knew what went on inside the inner courtyard when Shayla occupied it with her waitstaff, he was more interested in the fact that he was taking something away from Shayla. After all, he rationalized, she couldn't expect to receive the perks of a queen if she didn't respect and honor the king. Shayla held Mieko's hand as she approached the familiar entrance to the inner courtyard. Diemori had already been cautioned to stand behind the queen and wait in the hallway, out of the king's view. Shayla didn't need any more surprises brought on by the king's sudden anger. The sliding door was wide open and Kaylin stood in the center of the room. He wore a dark robe, his legs were spread shoulder-width apart, and his right arm was bent and tucked behind him with the back of his hand flat against his tailbone. In his left arm he held two wooden replicas of his Gen sword. His eyes were narrow and focused, but Shayla couldn't determine his mood. She decided to play it safe and not say a word as she ushered Mieko through the doorway. Mieko instinctively held her hand even tighter when she saw Kaylin standing still and looking like a scary warrior. Kaylin took a single step forward and resumed his imposing posture. "You will do exactly as I say and exactly as I do." Mieko nodded shyly, then turned back to her mother for support. Shayla nodded and softly pushed her forward. Mieko took 2 steps and stopped. Kaylin gently tossed one of the wooden swords to her. Shayla was relieved when Mieko caught it on her first attempt. Mieko turned back to her mother for a final time and Shayla responded with a reassuring nod before she stepped backwards through the door and shut it. She could hear Kaylin speak as she stared at the door and tried in vain to keep tears from flowing down her face. His words were indiscernible but spoken in a familiar authoritative tone. Mieko would have to perform at a level near perfection in order to maintain even an iota of Kaylin's respect. Mingzu's future was in her own hands and she had to succeed. Shayla gathered herself, did an about-face and headed toward the hallway. She rounded the corner and turned into the great hall where Dear Marie waited impatiently, with her arms folded across her chest. Shayla could see Dear Marie was trying desperately not to sulk, but she was failing miserably. Her shoulders were slumped over and her head hung low with such obvious petulance, Shayla had to force herself not to smile. Dear Marie, I know you do not care to be separated from Mieko, Shayla offered in understanding. However, will you endeavor zealously to not appear so annoyed? Dear Marie shrugged and kept her head hung low. Shayla snatched her hand and tugged her along. Come with me, child. They scurried down the passage, turned into a narrow, dark corridor lined in stained red oak and up an even narrower stairwell with faded crimson cobblestone steps. On the next landing they turned left and immediately stepped through a ruddy doorway and had to squeeze through a thin opening in the wall. The opening led to another passageway so narrow Shayla and Dear Marie had to turn sideways and sidestep through it. Dear Marie whispered as they inched their way through the narrow passage, "Mother, if you were wearing your royal frock you could not fit through the passage." And then it occurred to her that this trip through the narrow hallways was exactly why her mother wasn't wearing a royal frock. This adventure was planned and Shayla knew to dress in clothing that was more slimming, as was her red peony bodice. Wherever they were going, Shayla had navigated through the strange labyrinth of halls and tiny openings prior to that day. They stopped in front of a bare wall. At first Dear Marie thought that Shayla had made a wrong turn and she became frightened. She imagined being stuck in these tiny corridors between the walls of the castle forever. The thought was suffocating and her breath caught for a second. She surveyed the areas quickly, looking for a path to freedom and space when she noticed a seam in the wall. There were more seams on top and to the left and they connected to form the outline of a door. Shayla pushed the wall between the seams and the wall sank a quarter-inch in and then popped open. The seams outlined the hidden door to a secret room. Shayla and Dear Marie stepped inside the secret room. It was so small Dear Marie could stretch out her arms and touch opposite sides of the walls. The room was too small to do much of anything. It felt like a stone closet except there was a window where the floor touched the wall and it had a web of bars across it. Shayla put her forefinger to her lips. They needed to be absolutely quiet for their next move. She motioned for Dear Marie to squat and look through the window. Eased down to her knees and peeked down the window. There was a bright light shining up through whatever was below them. The light stung her eyes after being in such pithy darkness. As her eyes adjusted, she saw two figures in the room below. Then she smiled. Below them was the inner courtyard. Dear Marie and Shayla were in a secret room in the roof space above the courtyard that hung over the east wall. Dear Marie could see Kaylin and Mieko training below. She smiled even broader this time. Shayla kneeled and pulled Dear Marie closer. "From this room you can watch King train Mieko," she whispered as she leaned into Dear Marie's ear. "Watch and learn the sword the same way you learned the new Sigoma. Watch and see it in your mind. But know this, Dear Marie. It is a dangerous action we have taken. No one must know. Not even Mieko." Dear Marie was bubbling over and could barely contain herself and she boldly replied, "I will tell no one. I promise." Shayla leaned in again and kissed Dear Marie on the forehead. "Remember, my love. Do not make a sound. I will return for you shortly." She squeezed through the door again and turned back once more to see the look of glee on Dear Marie's face. She had already gotten comfortable on the floor, lying prone, her belly on the cool sandstone floor, hands tucked under her chin, legs bent at the knees and feet hovering above the back of her thighs. Shayla enjoyed the sight of Dear Marie for a few moments and then her breathing became heavy, her heart raced and her hands trembled. She quickly realized she was panicking as her spirit was filled with dread. She didn't want to ruin the moment for Dear Marie, so she quickly shut the door behind her and moved as fast as she could through the narrow passageways until she'd reached the great hall. Shayla stopped in the big room and took advantage of the high ceilings and wide corridor. The wide space offered some release and she took more deep breaths to steady her racing heart. She was scared and she didn't know why. But when Shayla looked up she saw Eolin running towards her. She could see Eolin had been crying and that scared her even more. "Eolin, what's wrong? What happened?" She rushed to get the words out as if saying them faster reduced the chance for bad things to happen. Eolin ran to the queen and bowed. I fear she is in her last moments, she stammered, out of breath. Shayla's eyes widened with horror and she darted away at a full sprint as Eowyn struggled to keep up with her. She ran through the gardens where purple daffodils grew next to yellow orchids and black lotus blossoms. Beech trees draped in hanging moss were nestled next to red wisterias and rainbow eucalyptus trees. Normally Shayla took a moment to enjoy the beauty of the trees, seeing something different in each blossom every day. This time, it was as if the trees were pale and colorless, or simple not there. She streaked through the gardens as if everything had been burned to ash. She felt her heart sink as she turned the corner and saw that the door to the maid's chamber was open. She was still a distance away, but she could see that the room was dark except for a candlelight burning someone inside. Shayla found herself afraid to enter right away, so she stopped at the front door. Eowyn came up behind her, took her elbow and ushered her inside. Shayla's eyes got accustomed to the low light quickly and she settled her gaze on a wooden canopy bed where Loaysa rested. She looked pale and sickly. Her condition brought tears to Shayla's eyes. Loaysa sensed the presence of the queen, weakly opened her eyes and sighed with relief. I've seen your face once more. Now my spirit can rest comfortably in the afterlife. SSH, Shayla lightly scolded her. You were meant to outlive us all. Empress Shayla, she said with deep respect and formality. I remember when you were a child walking with Emperor Gerwolf through the black wildwood as if you were walking through a garden. You were innocent and fearless. Just like Diemori is now. There is a reason why that is so. In order for the prophecy to take root, your courage must balance Kaelin's fear. Fear is what dictates his actions. Shayla scoffed. Fear? Kaelin fears nothing. He is powerful and unbeaten. The only thing stronger than the king is his all-consuming anger. Loaysa took Shayla's hand. He fears Diemori. Shayla unconsciously snatched her hand away. Diemori? Why? She is but a child. Loaysa licked her cracked lips as she took Shayla's hand. He fears Diemori for the same reason you hold her so close. She is destined for greater things. There is a design in her fate that is grander than a king, grander even than a mother's love. But Diemori cannot claim her purpose until you set her free. Shayla cupped Loaysa's hand and brought it to her lips for a soft kiss. All the while she shook her head, no. Her eyes closed as she spoke. You ask me to set her free. I nearly lost her once. How can I do that which wrenches my heart? Eowyn touched Shayla on the shoulder. Shayla opened her eyes and saw that Loaysa's frail hands no longer clutched her fingers. Shayla released her grip and Loaysa's freckled hand fell to the bed. Her eyes were open but her gaze was endless and without life. Shayla glanced to see if Loaysa's chest rose again with the breath of life, but it was still. Shayla heard a deep sigh escape from between Loaysa's parted lips. At that moment she knew that Loaysa was gone. Eowyn massaged the queen's shoulders. She has left us, my lady. Shayla thought about it for a moment. Loaysa was gone. She was Shayla's oldest friend in the world. She was also the only person in the Nyansveit castle who understood why Shayla had spent so much time in the Black Wildwood with Emperor Gerwolf when she was a child. Loaysa was an elder assigned to reinforce the legend of the Black Lotus. With Loaysa gone, there was no one left to guide her, to encourage her, to reassure her that the purpose for which she was called 2 decades ago was proceeding. The commitment that was made to Emperor Gerwolf and to the people of Nyansveit had started to take shape 12 years ago on the night Shayla was lost in the Black Wildwood. As foretold in prophecy and retold by Loaysa countless times, Shayla had brought forth the promise. It was difficult to believe because no one knew exactly what the promise would bring. Now there was no one left to contemplate what was next. At that moment Shayla felt a deep loss in her soul. She knew the servants who served the king and the warriors who guarded the castle would miss Loaysa, but none more than she. Without Loaysa, she was alone, and for the first time in many years, Shayla wasn't sure she could go on another day.